Now let's look at some of the objects that we find associated with the pharaohs interred in the pyramids of Giza. So this is an image of Khafre from Giza. So he has one of those pyramids, and this is a statue that we find of him. We can see I have a couple of different angles of his statue here. He's approximately 5'6", seated in the throne. And we'll want to pay attention to a few of the details that we see here. As you look at this, take a moment to try to consider how Khafre is being represented. How would you describe the way, the style in which he's represented? What we're going to see is that there's a great deal of rigidity with how our pharaohs are presented. There's not a lot of variety in their poses, not a lot of variety in their expression. Everything is very determined, very rigid, with maybe one important exception that we'll get to a little bit later on. He's seated in his throne, upright. We see his shoulders are back. As we look at the musculature and the way that he's being presented here, we'll notice that there are basically no imperfections. It's a highly idealized form and body type. As we look at his face, we'll see that he has a calm, peaceful expression. He's wearing the headdress associated with a pharaoh. All of these things that we're picking out should sound a little familiar. We talked a bit about these kinds of representations last week when we looked at Mesopotamian rulers. Very much the same idea here. We want to take all of the idealized notions of what leadership is and what our ideal notions of what a king should be, and we want to embody them in these statues, embody them in these sculptures. So we see pharaohs that are eternally youthful, we see them strong, muscular, and we see faces that are calm, that are peaceful, maybe even pleasant, all of those sorts of things that we want to associate with leadership. All regardless of whether or not that was accurate to who Khafre actually was. Perhaps he was quite an angry guy. Perhaps he was a hothead. Perhaps he had a scar on his face. He had perhaps wrinkles before he died. All of that is quite likely, but you won't see it in a representation of the pharaoh. The pharaohs are gods on earth, and we see them represented in that sort of immortal, timeless quality that's very important. It's a part of this hierarchy of representation that, again, we spoke about last week. Very much a part of the artwork of the ancient Egyptians. We have very rigid standards, very rigid conventions for how we're going to display the pharaoh. When we get to people of a lower strata within the class hierarchy of Egyptian society, some of those rules change. Taking another look at Khafre here, we're going to notice some peculiar things. If you can make out, in his right hand is clasped into a fist, and you can see that it looks like he's holding something there. That's not an accident. It's not anything that was broken off in there. Well, all we're seeing there in his clasped fist is that the sculptor did not excavate out that extra material to create the interior part of the hand. He just left that material there. Also, in Khafre's back, where his back meets the back of the throne, the material where normally you would see at the small at the back, there would be a gap between a person's back and the chair. That material has not been excavated. That is still there, a part of the stone. Again, done on purpose. We have this idea of an emperor that is eternal, that is forever, that will stand the test of time, much like the rock, much like the pyramids, much like the Nile River itself. All of this is a very important part of the symbolism. The pharaoh is like the rock. He is sort of one with the stone. And we get that sense of permanence and that sense of that static nature of his rule through these little details, not removing all the excess rock, keeping him very still and static and perfected in his form. All of these things are going to communicate politically what we want the people to accept about our ruler. Let's take a quick look at a close-up of Khafre. So now we've looked a little bit at Khafre, let's look at Menkaure. So Menkaure is another pharaoh that had one of the temples, or one of the pyramids at Giza, and this is one of his representations. Not life-size, as you can see, this is only about 4.5 feet tall, so it's not a full-size representation, but it is of Menkaure and his queen that we see at his side here. We'll see many of the same characteristics, many of the same features with Menkaure that we saw with Khafre. He's not seated in a throne, but you'll notice again how very rigid he is, how very static his pose is. Again, we're not taking that time to excavate the extra stone material in between his arms or between the two figures. And again, that's not an accident, that's not a lack of skill on behalf of the artist. That's a part of the permanence of the piece. It's part of the message of the piece itself. He's wearing, Menkaure is wearing the headdress that we would associate with a pharaoh of this era. And I want to compare Menkaure to his queen here. She is also of an extremely elevated status, of course, within the social hierarchy, being the queen to the pharaoh. So she is also represented in this very rigid stance, in this very rigid set of rules of representation. You'll notice that she is allowed just a little bit to break out of some of those conventions. She actually has her arms around her husband. She's expressing just a little bit of movement, natural movement here. It's not much, but it is communicating to us that there is a social hierarchy here. Menkaure is at the top of that hierarchy. He actually shows no indication of any sort of gesture towards his wife, whereas the queen here is allowed a little bit of that movement to the side, but it's still very rigid and very controlled. I also want to draw your attention to their feet and how they're standing. We see the striding posture where the figures are moving forward. That's an important symbol of vitality and life that we'll see not just with the Egyptians, but with the ancient Greeks as well when we get to them. We'll notice that our pharaoh is striding just a little bit further than the queen. His feet are a little bit further apart than the queen's. Again, that's an important symbol in the social hierarchy, who has control here. Our pharaohs typically were married and had a sort of a chief queen, but they would have many, many wives who were all sort of arranged in a hierarchy of their own. The line of succession in ancient Egypt was to the oldest male heir, and it would go down the line of the many wives that the pharaoh had. So the primary wife, the chief queen that the pharaoh was married to, if she had any sons by the pharaoh, that would be the heir. If there were no sons from the queen, frankly, they would just sort of go down the line of what were referred to as the lesser wives, until we found an old enough male heir who could assume the throne. How these marriages were arranged were very often within family lines. Brothers would marry sisters or cousins. It was very much believed that you needed to keep the bloodline pure, to keep the godly nature of the pharaoh and the pharaoh's bloodline as untainted as possible. So this led to some, interesting developments within the social hierarchy, to be sure. Now, there's a very important exception to this rule that comes in the form of Hatshepsut. I believe your book discusses her in more detail. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to get into a lot of it to her within this presentation, just because of the length of having to tell that whole story. But it is a fascinating story of how one pharaoh, a woman, was able to really break down this social hierarchy for at least a short period of time. But she had a lot against her, Hatshepsut did, because this was the norm. This was the standard that we're looking at here with Menkaure. And it was a very rigid part of Egyptian society. So let's say that you're not a pharaoh, though, and you live in ancient Egypt. What kind of representations could you expect to have? Well, let's take a look at this guy. This man was a scribe, so his job was a bit bureaucratic. He took records. He would sit, to use a modern term, in an office job. He would sit and take official records and documents and write it down. So he was literate. That's very important. And he had this sort of special, again, to use a modern term, what we might consider a sort of middle-class desk job, where he got to sit and sort of listen to people, take notes, take records, and do this sort of thing. So he's of an elevated class. He's not a poor man. He's not at the lower level of the social hierarchy. At the same time, he's absolutely not royal. He's not a part of the pharaoh's family. He's not a part of the priest class. So again, he's kind of sort of in the middle of that social hierarchy. And this is exactly the type of representation that that kind of an individual could expect. Now, as we look at him, we're noticing that he's painted. He's got a lot more naturalistic figures. He's been painted. He's carved out of limestone. Again, not a very large piece, about 1 foot 9 inches tall. And we see him in the performance of his job. He's seated, cross-legged. On his lap, he's holding a small tablet. We believe he would have originally been holding a stylus in his hand so that he could write. We can see that his head is up, his eyes are lifted. He's waiting for somebody to speak so he can write it down and do his job. And this is a wonderful example of this hierarchy of representation. We see how the pharaohs have this very rigid set of conventions. They have to be eternally youthful. They have to look strong. They have to look static. All of those things associated with leadership. Once you go down that social ladder to figures who are not as high up in the hierarchy, a lot of those conventions loosen up a little bit. We can be a lot more representational. Look at this guy. His name is K, we believe. We get a sense of his haircut. We get a sense of his physique. Look, he's got little love handles on the side of his body. He's a little bit flabby, as you might expect with somebody who sits at a desk all day, who just sits down on the job. We see this wonderful level of realism with this guy that you just would not be able to see with a pharaoh. It would be considered inappropriate, offensive, and not accurate for the pharaoh. But we do get to see it in these pieces. So this representation of K would have been placed in his mastaba. He would have had a family mastaba in Saqqara, where this would have been installed as a part of his funerary custom. He would have been mummified. They would have read passages of the Book of the Dead, and very much the same thing, the same kind of procedure that a pharaoh would go through, but on a much, much smaller scale. Instead of a pyramid, he gets a mastaba. Instead of these large statues of hard stone with this sort of eternal youthfulness, he gets a much more representational portrait on a smaller scale. But the principles are very much still the same. Of course, these funeral complexes, whether you were a pharaoh or further down the social ladder, didn't just have three-dimensional objects, statues within them. They were also typically very brightly and vibrantly painted. So here's an example from the tomb of Nabanum in Thebes. This little section of fresco we're looking at is about 2 feet 8 inches tall, and it's a fowling and fishing scene. So we see in the center of the composition, there's Nabanum, and he's an administrative official. He's not royal per se, but he is a little bit higher up in the social hierarchy. So he gets a really nice tomb, and he gets some really nice representation within it. He's the largest figure in the scene, so that idea of hierarchy of scale still applies with Nabanum. To our right, we see his wife represented on a slightly smaller scale, and sitting on the boat underneath him is his daughter. So it's actually a really nice little family scene where we see Nabanum. He enjoys hunting and fishing and doing those sorts of activities here in the real world. When he dies and his soul goes on to the afterlife, he wants to be able to enjoy those things in the afterlife. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, in ancient Egypt, anything you want to enjoy or experience or have to have in this realm, you have to take with you to the afterlife. You have to take with you to the next realm. How they do that is through representation, through art. So Nabanum wants to be able to enjoy these leisure activities in the afterlife, so he needs to have those representations in his tomb. And that's what we see here. Very brightly colored, beautiful scene, lots of fantastic detail in those fish and all of the fowl, all of the birds that we see. If you look just to the left of Nabanum, just above the bow of the ship, you can see a cat grabbing one of the birds. And cats were, of course, really important symbols in ancient Egyptian mythology. They were very important. And we believe that they were a big part of the society there. That people had cats. There were cats in the city. You went hunting with their hunting cat. All of those sorts of things were a big part of Egyptian culture. This scene is also from the tomb of Nabanum, so same guy we were just looking at. And these are some other things that he would like to enjoy in the afterlife. Dancing girls and lots of wine. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. We're seeing a group of musicians, women, dressed up quite elaborately. We're also seeing a couple of sort of nubile young women dancing with very little clothing on over on the right-hand side. And on the far right, we see many, many jugs, probably of wine, stacked up, being ready to be enjoyed. Again, this seems like an odd thing to be put in a funerary complex until you understand the message that's being conveyed. These are part of the things that Nabanum enjoys. Music, dancing, girls, women, wine, all of that fun stuff that he wants to continue to enjoy in the afterlife, this social aspect of life. If he wants his soul to continue to enjoy these things in the afterlife, he needs representations of them in his tomb so that his soul can access them. We also see this as a representation of that hierarchy that we've been talking about. These figures are not necessarily portraits of specific women, of specific individuals. They're just there as stand-ins, placeholders for the real thing. And we see in these portraits, particularly the group of musicians on the left, we see them in three-quarter portraits. We see them tilted and bending in different ways. You absolutely would never see a pharaoh portrayed in this sort of naturalism. You would never see Nabanum in his own tomb portrayed with this sort of naturalism. But since this tomb is not for these women, they are just, again, kind of stand-ins for what's needed in the afterlife. We can approach them much differently, with a different style and a different level of representation. So for all our discussion of the rigidity of the style of pharaonic representation, there's always an exception to the rule. And that's what we're looking at here with Akhenaten, our pharaoh. Akhenaten comes to rule right about 1353 BCE. And although he is a part of this long-standing bloodline, this long-standing pharaonic tradition, he decides he's going to change things up and that he's going to radically alter the conventions of style within this culture. What he does is first of all, he changes the religious hierarchy. Now, keep in mind that, like other cultures we've been looking at in this course, there is absolutely no separation of church and state within ancient Egypt. The religion is the politics and so on. They are completely entwined. So here we have a pharaoh. He is established and is inaugurated as the pharaoh, the same way that pharaohs for thousands of years before him have been done. Once he gains power, however, he decides, you know what, I'm going to completely change the religious structure. What he does is he basically he overthrows the cult of Horus and Osiris, who had been the gods, the Egyptian gods who have ruled over Egypt and who have been closely associated with the pharaoh. And he brings in a new cult, the cult of Aton. Akhenaten referring to his dedication to Aten. With this new cult comes a new style. Aten is represented by the sun in the sky, and Akhenaten deems himself to be the direct son, the direct child of Aten. So he's still using this religious framework to legitimize his absolute rule. But he brings in a whole new different style of representation. So as we look at this statue of Akhenaten, this is a statue that's about 13 feet high. It's still quite a monumental piece, but you're immediately going to see a lot of radical differences. He's quite a bit elongated. His features are elongated. We see a bit more curvature on his body, even though he still wears a traditional headdress and that beard piece that hangs from his chin, which was not actual facial hair. It was a part of the headdress. We see his arms crossed in front of him. All of these are traditional. Pharaohs, going back for thousands of years, have been posed in that way. But we see the manner that he portrays his body is going to be quite radically different. Let's take a look at a close-up of this. Here's a slightly closer image where you can see Akhenaten's features, and although he's still idealized, we don't see any imperfections per se. We don't see any wrinkles or scars, so that much is still the same. We can still see that there's quite a bit of an exaggeration, and it just overall has a much different feel to it than previous representations of the pharaoh have had. Now, you don't come into office and change the entire religious structure of ancient Egyptian society without making some enemies, and Akhenaten certainly had a lot of enemies. And certainly one point of debate amongst historians is why exactly Akhenaten might have wanted to create such radical change. Some people point to the influence of his wife. We'll talk a bit about her in a second. She was from the Nubian area of Egypt, which is a little bit further south down the Nile than Cairo and some of the major population centers that we associate with ancient Egypt. We believe, a lot of scholars think, that she was bringing a lot of influence on her husband, that she wasn't simply just his chief queen, his number one wife. Akhenaten had many wives, like pharaohs do, but that she actually had a great deal of influence on him. A lot of people think that Akhenaten, perhaps due to inbreeding, was a bit sickly, may have been a bit feeble physically, perhaps even mentally, although we certainly have no way of knowing that, and that his wife, a woman named Nefertiti, would have had a lot of influence on him, and she may have been bringing some of her background from Nubia and some of the religious ideas from Nubia and bringing them to Akhenaten and perhaps convincing him to change things up in Egypt proper. So let's take a look at his wife, Nefertiti. So perhaps you've seen this image before. It's quite a famous piece. We do know the artisan who created it was Thutmose, and this is a portrait of Nefertiti, Akhenaten's wife. We believe she may have been from Nubia, and that we do know that she had a great deal of influence on Akhenaten. She may have been sort of the power behind the throne, as they say. So she's bringing these influences, and she's sort of perhaps ruling through her husband, trying to bring an important amount of social change into Egypt itself. Why she feels it's necessary to do this, again, there's a lot of speculation. We're not entirely sure, but it's an amazing sort of thing that she's able to accomplish through her husband Akhenaten. Akhenaten completely rewrites the hierarchy, the religious hierarchy in ancient Egypt. He basically says that the worship of Aton must come before all other worship of the gods. So no more temples to Horus or Osiris or dedications to Amun-Ra. It must all be focused on Aton and Aton's only son, him, Akhenaten. This, of course, as I mentioned, makes the priestly class, the clergy within ancient Egypt, extremely upset, and they do not like this at all, and starts to create a great deal of instability within Egypt because of this. As we take a look at this portrait of Nefertiti, to get away from the politics a little bit and just look at the aesthetics here, this is a beautiful piece, carved out of limestone and painted. We see a fair level of naturalism in this piece that we don't typically associate with pharaonic or royal portraiture. She's got a little bit of damage on her because, you know, she's several thousand years old at this point. We see this beautiful headdress. And as far as we know, this is a fairly accurate representation of the type of crown that the real Nefertiti wore. We see that she's painted. We get a good sense of her skin tone, the makeup she would have worn, the jewelry around her neck. Again, probably all very accurate to a typical representation of what she actually looked like. Another possible influence on Akhenaten and his sudden change of the status quo was probably from this woman, Tiya. This was Nefertiti's mother. Now, this is quite a small portrait. It's just over 3 inches tall, but we get some amazing detail in here. It's really fantastic. So this was, in essence, Akhenaten's mother-in-law. And she was there in the capital. She was there with Nefertiti and Akhenaten, and probably had a great deal of influence as well. She may have been a driving force in the decision to make these radical changes within the social hierarchy of Egypt. You can see there's some beautiful detail in this piece. This is carved out of wood and inlaid with gold, silver, and all kinds of precious stones. We get a great expression on her face. It's so serious and intense. We definitely get a sense of the power of these women in their relationship to the throne. Here's another representation from Akhenaten's rule, where again we can see this radical difference in representational style that's being incorporated here. We see Akhenaten, our pharaoh himself, on the left, and he's holding one of his daughters. Nefertiti is seated on the right, and she's holding 2 more of the daughters. We see Nefertiti's characteristic crown, and in the center, between them at the top of this panel, you see this disk of the sun and the rays of the light from the sun coming down and touching both Akhenaten and Nefertiti. So that's a symbol of Aton. That's a symbol of the sun god that Akhenaten has changed everything to center around. It's an amazingly unique portrait. We just do not see any other pharaoh that has a representation of himself in this kind of family domestic scene. Here we see our sun god incarnate, Akhenaten, gently playing with and caring for his infant daughter. It's really astounding. We just don't see that representation. There's a great deal of humanizing going on in this piece, where we see our pharaoh and his queen and their children behaving quite normally, quite human-like, displaying human emotions and being represented sort of sitting around slouching in their chairs. Absolutely unheard of prior to this shift, prior to this change. Really an extraordinary thing. Now, as I pointed out with this, the children in the scene are all daughters. They're all girls. Nefertiti did not have any sons by Akhenaten, so there was no direct heir here. So you might see where this is going. Once Akhenaten himself passes away, the people in charge of the religious sector, the clergy, the priests, and so on, they are very quick to try to get rid of all of the changes that Akhenaten made. They want to go back to the way it was beforehand as quickly as possible. If Nefertiti had had a son, she would have been able to get the son installed as the next emperor, and probably could have continued, quite likely could have continued the changes and kept things in place the way she and Tia had tried to construct through Akhenaten. But since that wasn't the case, she was essentially pushed out of power because she was not allowed to take the throne herself. And a son by Akhenaten and one of his so-called lesser wives was the one to take the throne after his death. And although he wasn't particularly noteworthy during the time of his rule, he is a pharaoh that most of us today will recognize immediately. The son of Akhenaten who rules after his death is, of course, King Tutankhamun, better known to us as King Tut. So this is the funeral coffin of Tutankhamun from his tomb at Thebes. So you probably already know a little bit about King Tut. He's quite famous in the history of Egyptology. He's sort of his own star in popular culture. But as I mentioned, he was the oldest male heir to Tutankhamun. To Akhenaten. Once Akhenaten dies, the priestly class wants to reestablish the status quo, wants to get rid of the cult of Aton and all of the changes that Akhenaten had made. So they install Tutankhamun as the heir. So he is Akhenaten's son, but not Nefertiti's son. So they're able to basically push out Nefertiti and push out her influence, cut her off from the power structure. Essentially what happens is Tutankhamun is only about 8 to 10 years old when he's made pharaoh. By all accounts, he was kind of a sickly child, wasn't a very strong boy. And he was essentially, we believe, a puppet pharaoh. Because he was so young and not necessarily the most able-bodied, the priests and those who were trying to reestablish the old order basically used him as a puppet and ruled through him, using Tutankhamun to throw out all of the changes that Akhenaten had made and reestablish the status quo. And he did just that. Tutankhamun reestablished the old religion, reestablished the old temples, and ruled at the hands of the priestly class. And because of that, we see representations of Tutankhamun from his tomb is very much right back to the old conventional style. So the elongation, the abstraction, the humanization that we saw in representations of Akhenaten, completely gone from Tutankhamun. He looks much closer to Khafre or Menkaure or Ramses or any of the other pharaohs that came before him. Let's take a look at his death mask, which is quite famous. So why is Tutankhamun so famous and well known to us today? It really wasn't because of anything extraordinary that he did as emperor. He did bring back the old traditional ways and bring back the old religion, again, really under the influence of others who basically told him what to do. He was not a great military conqueror. He did not expand the empire. He did not negotiate important trade agreements. He really didn't do that much to further advance the Egyptian realm of influence. He died when he was still quite young. He was approximately 18 or 19 years old when he died. So he was in office. He ruled for about 9 to 10 years or so. Lots and lots of speculation over the cause of his death. There are some theorists who say he was murdered. There are other people who say he was just quite ill and sickly, and that ultimately decided his death. Lots of speculation on that, lots of conspiracy theories. What we do know for certain, though, is that he had a pharaoh's burial in a tomb at Thebes. But frankly, although, as we look at his death mask here, which is gold inlaid with precious stones, it's this amazing, gorgeous piece. The type of objects and the things that were placed in Tut's tomb were nowhere near as spectacular or gorgeous as some of the pharaoh's objects of previous pharaohs, previous generations, because frankly King Tut wasn't that important. As I said, he didn't really achieve any monumental feats in the short period of time that he ruled. When he died, a new emperor, a new pharaoh was installed. Tutankhamun was buried. All of the golden and luxurious objects were put in his tomb. His tomb was sealed up, and he was more or less forgotten. People didn't speak of him. He wasn't important enough for his name to come down in history. People more or less just forgot he was there, forgot where his tomb was, and he wasn't really recorded very well in history. Because of that, his tomb remained pretty much intact. Frankly, and this sounds kind of awful to say, Tut wasn't important enough to be stolen from. There were other bigger, more famous pharaohs with a lot more gold and a lot more precious objects, and the thieves went for those tombs and were breaking into those tombs. And Tut's tomb was kind of lost. People forgot where it was and was just sort of lost to history until 1922. When an explorer and archaeologist by the name of Howard Carter was leading an exhibition in the Valley of Kings and was digging around. He wasn't looking for Tut in particular. He was just looking for pharaohs, gold, and mummies, and all of that good stuff. And he just happened upon this tomb. What makes it extraordinary then to history and why we know about Tut today is because of these circumstances of Tut's rule and his death and his burial. His tomb was almost completely intact. And when Howard Carter found this tomb in 1922, it was the first time that modern historians, modern scholars, had ever had a chance to look at a completely intact burial chamber for a pharaoh. All of the other ones that had been found had been broken into, had been vandalized, had been stolen from. So it's an interesting twist of fate. Tutankhamun was pretty much unknown and unremarked immediately after his death. He wasn't, frankly, considered a very important ruler. But now, after Howard Carter, and because of those circumstances, he's frankly the symbol of Egypt. You can't visit Egypt without seeing representations of Tut's face on everything, everywhere. Even people who've never been to Egypt, if you show them this image, they're probably going to know, oh, that's King Tut. We have that representation. He's become practically a symbol of the modern nation-state of Egypt. So it's an interesting turn of fate. It just took a few thousand years for him to gain that recognition. So it's an interesting turn of events that allows Tut to gain this notoriety that we associate with him. And just imagine, look at this death mask. It's absolutely gorgeous. We see all of the old conventions have been firmly reestablished. A youthful, calm expression on the face, all of these beautiful stones, the amazing craftsmanship that goes into this death mask. This would have been placed on the mummy, Tut's mummy itself, within his tomb. There would have been several coffins sort of cocooning him within the tomb itself. And as I said, he didn't have all the same ritual and level of extravagance as other pharaohs would have had. So it's a bit mind-boggling to think that for a pharaoh, this is the cheap stuff. This was not the most over-the-top representations that we would have had. So one more object from Tut's tomb, found in Thebes, a painted chest made of wood. It's approximately 1 foot and 8 inches long, so it's not a very large piece. But again, being that it's wood, it's really amazing that it's in such good condition. On the very front panel, and this thing is entirely covered with these really amazing representations, but on the very front panel here of this chest, you can see a figure in a chariot riding this chariot into battle. And on the right-hand side, you see sort of the chaos of battle, the enemies being trampled, and it's very chaotic. To the left-hand side of the chariot, you see clear registers. It's much more organized, where you see soldiers on chariots. The figure in the center who's the largest figure in the composition, is Tut. That's Tutankhamun, riding into battle. We see a couple of falcons overhead. Those are symbols of the god Horus, who's helping him in his battle, carrying him on his way. Behind him on the left are the Egyptian armies that he is leading into conflict. And then on the right, that chaos, that assemblage of people and horses and that chaos that we see over there, those are the enemy that are going to be trampled by the relentless forward progress of the Egyptian military machine. This is entirely fiction. Tutankhamun never led an army into battle. He didn't defeat anybody in battle. Even if he had waged war as the pharaoh, you don't put your pharaoh on the front lines where he's riding into battle in danger. He sort of stays back and gives orders from behind. So this is entirely fiction. It never actually happened, but that's not important. That's not important to the representation. What's important here is that we have a demonstration of our emperor, of our pharaoh, as a fearless leader, one with the gods, sweeping the Egyptian culture and Egyptian religion forward against all possible enemies. The message is what's important. You could consider this a type of propaganda in that way. It's meant in service of promoting the story and the culture. And the fact that this wasn't indicative of an actual event is really not important to the people who created it. So I'd like to end this week giving you a few things to think about and to consider, some things you might want to write down in your notes, some questions that might help you with your writing assignment and with other participation in the course. So as you're looking over this lecture and reading in your book, speculate about the building of the Great Pyramids. There's a great number of theories on how those were actually practically put together. Think about that a minute. How do you speculate they were built? What kind of problems do you think needed to be overcome in order to create those objects? I also want you to consider how Egyptian art may be stylistically similar to Mesopotamian art of the same time. So these cultures exist at the same time. There's a great deal of overlap in terms of chronology. Do you notice any differences, any striking similarities between things that we looked at last week and what we've seen so far this week? Also, consider what would be some reasons for the modification of pyramid scale when we go from step pyramids to the full pyramids at Giza, and the institution of rock-cut tombs, which I did not really get into in this presentation, but your book will have a lot to say about that. Rock-cut tombs were another very important innovation that the Egyptians were able to do, quite mind-boggling in its own right. Think a bit about the practical reasons for that and the timing of that. Why did Egyptians need to make that shift? Also consider how a change in religion brings about a change in the art in ancient Egypt. So we talked about that a bit here. And this is something that we'll see in many cultures when you have a dramatic change in the religious or social hierarchy. Radical changes in the art representation always follow. So think a bit about why that might be and why that might have been the case here in ancient Egypt. With all that in mind, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email me. My email address can be found on the Blackboard site. There's also the online office section of Blackboard. If you just have a general question, you can drop it in there. Please make sure you're making progress on the writing assignment. Let me know if you have any concerns about that. So that's it for this week, and until next time, I'll talk at you later.